Hey, creator kings and queens! Welcome to Business Models for Creators, the show where we explore the reality of people living the creator dream and help you turn your creator dream into reality. I'm your host, Jasmine Love, and today we have a very special episode. It is the 1-year anniversary of Business Models for Creators being live and out in the world. So for this 1-year anniversary episode, we are doing a solo episode. This is a record. I think this is my longest non-writing creative project. I have tried and failed many times before to get into creating content. I first started dabbling in YouTube way back in 2013 when the internet was newer. If I had stuck with it, I probably would be further along. But I first started dabbling in YouTube in 2013, and I was really bad at it and didn't make it very far. And, I dabbled a little more in 2014, but then I stopped creating content besides writing content for a really long time. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, I jumped back into YouTube and it was going just fine, but I got shiny object syndrome. It was like, TikTok, I could go viral on TikTok. So I jumped into trying to do TikTok and it was fun for a while, but I burned out within like 2 months. And then I didn't create content for a while, but now here we are in 2024 and I've had one creative project for a whole year. And in fact, Business Models for Creators, I've been working on it for 2 years. It's been published for 1 year, but I first conceived the idea in April of 2022. There is this book I discovered called Work that came out in the 70s where these journalists went around and interviewed people, everyday people in a variety of jobs about their day-to-day work life. And then I think in the 2000s, a more modern book called Gig came out. And Gig was the book I read and it was very interesting. And I wanted to do a podcast. It was like work and like gig. And then I later found out there was a documentary on Netflix starring Barack Obama called Work or Working or something. It's very similar to that book where he interviewed people about their day-to-day work life. But I came up with the podcast idea before that Netflix special came out, I think, or before I heard of it. I wanted my podcast to be like a model of those books, Work and Gig. But then I dove into studying the art and craft of podcasting, and I found out it's better to niche down instead of being so broad, talking to a bunch of people about a bunch of stuff. It's better to niche down. And my favorite kind of people are creators. So, and I'm like, I like the whole concept of content creators. The people I really look up to are content creators. So I wanted to talk to creators and creative professionals. So I niched down to that. And I started interviewing people informally about what it's like to have a podcast and how can I make a podcast. I read books about podcasts, listened to podcasts about podcasts. Then finally, I think it was the summer of 2022, I was ready to create a test episode. So thankfully, my dear friend Jeri agreed to be my volunteer to do my test episode with. And we tried to do it, but we had so many tech issues. And at the time, I didn't know it, but it's because I had the wrong kind of internet. I had the wrong kind of computer, and I had the wrong kind of internet. And I think I tried another test episode and realized my internet was not fast enough. So I think I tried to create another test episode, and I thought I could just upgrade my internet with the provider I had, but the provider I had didn't even offer the speed of internet I needed to conduct a podcast. So I had to switch internet providers, and it was a big hassle. And at the time, it seemed like this overwhelming obstacle. But I just got a new internet provider. I had to pay more money. I got a new computer. I got a gaming computer so it can handle podcasting capabilities. So I was off to the races, but then I had the obstacle of how am I going to find guests? I'm a no-name podcaster with no audience. Who's going to be on my show? And I was so nervous to ask people, and I didn't think I could find guests. But thankfully, my dear friend Janelle, who's been a big friend of the show, a friend of me and a friend of the show, agreed to be my first guest. And I don't think the show would exist were it not for Janelle being willing to be my guest. and we recorded, I think it was Christmas Eve 2023, and we had so much fun. And once the episode was recorded, I was off to the races, but I was still kind of afraid to ask people to be on my show, but it became easier over time, and I got guests. I didn't think I would get any guests, but I got guests. And I'm glad I started recording in advance so I could have like a library of content and I wasn't racing every month to come up with a new episode. So I started recording in December and I didn't launch my first episode till May of the following year. So I had a bank of content and I was one of the best things I could have done for myself. And so, yeah, I released the first episode in May of 2023. And it's been a year, like I said, that we've been publishing. And it's been 2 years since the podcast has been conceived. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening for a year. Thank you for rooting me on as I work through those obstacles of finding guests and of getting the technology together and learning the ropes of podcasting. And I still have a lot to learn. But in honor of this 1 year anniversary episode, I want to share the top 3 things I've learned from podcasting in general. And I want to share my top 3 favorite lessons I've learned from my guests. Okay, lesson 1 I learned. They say it takes a whole village to raise a child. Well, it takes a whole village to do a podcast. I know some people do their podcast like literally in a closet on their own. But for me, it's like a whole village. Before I even started recording, as I was conceiving the show and putting it together, I hopped on the phone with my brother Chad. He had a podcast with my other brother Corey. I talked to both Chad and Corey about what it was like to be a podcaster, how to start a podcast, things to watch out for. And they both were so informative and helpful. And I'm so grateful I had them to lean on. I read so many books and listened to so many podcasts and joined Facebook groups. So it took that whole village. And I found my editor, Kelly, and this podcast literally wouldn't exist without her. If I had to do all of the editing myself, I would have burnt out already. Like, yeah, I would have quit already. But thankfully, I had Kelly to outsource to, and she has consulted with me and coached me and counseled me and also done the nitty-gritty implementation of editing. And I'm so grateful for her. I mentioned Janelle, her being my first guest. The show wouldn't have gotten like off the ground without her. And not only was Janelle my first guest, she rooted me along every episode. She introduced me to one of my other favorite guests, Michelle. I wouldn't have known Michelle wasn't that for Janelle. Oh, now we're rhyming. Michelle and Janelle in the house. But Janelle came to every podcast watch party and was there in the chat, keeping it interesting. And I know I would not have stayed motivated without Janelle in my corner, rooting me along and being a part of this experience with me. So Chad, Corey, Janelle, Kelly, everybody who's listened, Laura has listened in and given me feedback. Yeah, every single listener, every comment, it takes a whole village to keep the machine moving and to succeed. So I always have to remember that whenever I get into a creative endeavor, I don't want to do it in a basement or in the closet by myself. I want to involve my community, involve the village. So I learned that lesson. It takes a whole village. Okay, there was a really big challenge I had when I first started podcasting, and I feel like I've overcome it, but I probably shouldn't say it. I don't want to jinx it and be faced with this problem again. But when I first started podcasting, I was afraid to ever disagree with my guests or push back on them. I didn't want anyone to regret sitting down with me and being on my show. So I was really agreeable. And early on, I had a guest that said multiple things I really didn't agree with, and I didn't speak up. And I regretted not speaking up. So I knew I had to work on being more assertive in my interview style, asking tougher questions, offering fresh perspectives. So yeah, I had to not be afraid to push back. So as I got further along and interview more guests, I started being more open to disagreeing with them, not in a combative way. This isn't cable news where we have screaming talking heads. And I'm generally a pretty agreeable person, but I started being more willing to ask tough questions and push back and offer alternative perspectives to my guests. So I'm glad I overcame that. But yeah, I I'm not a master at it by any means. There's some people like that you watch on TV, they do the real tough, combative interviews, and that's not me. It's not my style, but I'm glad I did get the guts to just not let anybody say any and everything and to kind of push back and encounter different ideas. Lesson number 3, I learned there is more than one successful outcome for a podcast. Ideally, I would have millions of viewers and followers and have sponsorships to be making a full-time income from my podcast. And it didn't turn out that way, and I didn't expect it to turn out that way in just 1 year. But I got some surprise gifts and successful outcomes that I couldn't have anticipated. Because of my podcast, I got to reconnect with an old friend from law school, my friend Anthony Andrix, the author of Repurposed, and I got to interview him and help him promote his book through a series of interviews. And I don't think I would have been recommended for that opportunity were it not for my podcast. My friend and old research partner from law school, Lori, recommended me to Anthony. The rest is history. I got to do this really cool project and help with a book that I really love with a person I adore. And like I said, I don't think the opportunity would have come to me without the podcast. So I'm so grateful for that, and I couldn't have anticipated that. Another surprise blessing I got was my friendship with my friend Ashley Campuzano. She was, I think, my third guest on the show. And I didn't really know her when I interviewed her, but we really clicked and we really vibed. And she's like, we should talk regularly. So we set up a monthly call where we check in and talk about our lives and our careers. And we've been doing that for several months now. And I love talking to Ashley. I adore her. She's so special. And we wouldn't have connected and become friends the way we have were it not for having her on my podcast. So yeah, I initially started the podcast. One of my biggest goals was to be able to sit down with creators I admire. I wanted an excuse to be friends with people I admire. And I haven't invited any of these people on the show yet, but I want to meet Sarah Marshall from You're Wrong About. I want to meet Francesca Fiorentini from The Habituation Room, John Idarola from The Damage Report, Lacey Mosley from Scam Goddess, and the Remix Brothers, who have a YouTube channel where they remix like news stories and make songs out of them. So I want to sit down and talk to these people, but I know they just wouldn't talk to a random stranger. But if I have a podcast, that's an excuse to sit down and talk with the people I admire. So this season, I chickened out. I was too afraid to ask any of those people I named to be on my show. But I end up getting to make friends with and sit down with other people I admire, even though they hadn't been on my list. I got my dream guest on my show. One of my dream guests was my own baby brother, Corey Barton. He's a creative genius. He is just a genius. And I've always wanted to collaborate with him on something creative. I got to have him on the show and we had the time of our lives. It was the funniest episode I recorded. We had a really good time. And one of our reels was the most popular reel I ever published. It got thousands of views. So I'm so happy I had Corey on the show. I got to have Juliet M. Banks on the show. She's a very successful author. And previous to having Juliet on the show, I had a guest that said you can't make money writing fiction. But Juliet makes 6 figures writing fiction. And I followed her career for a long time, since when she was in corporate all the way to becoming a full-time author. And I really admire her and have enjoyed following her path. And I got to have her on the show. So yeah, the show has allowed me to really connect with people and make friends and sit down with people I admire. And hopefully in future seasons, I'll sit down with the people I am super fans for. But we will see. Okay, now I'm going to jump into the 3 lessons I've learned from my guests. I've learned a lot from my guests, and a lot of them told really great stories and shared really great advice, but I am just going to share my top 3 favorite lessons. So Jeri said, if you want to go to the moon, don't focus on the moon, focus on learning how to build rockets. And I love this because all too often we all focus on the destination or that title we want. Like, oh, I want to be a writer, or I want to be a podcaster. But instead of focusing on that title or that designation or that destination, to instead focus on the craft, roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, dig in that dirt, and just become a craftsman or craftswoman and focus on that, focus on getting good, focus on the day to day. And that's part of why I created this podcast too. People have this idea of what they want to be and these titles they want to achieve. But I really wanted to pull back the curtain and dig into what the day to day, with the craft of these creative endeavors is like, so people can see if it's for them. So do you actually like building rockets, or does the moon just look really glamorous, and exotic? So I really like that advice. Focus on learning how to build rockets. Lesson number 2, I learned from my guest, Michelle. Most of my guests are against having a morning routine, and it has been a big theme for my show is the anti-morning routine. But Michelle loves her morning routine, and she has an amazing morning routine. And one of my favorite parts of it is she makes her to-do list, and then she applies something called the Janelle rule. Janelle, I don't know if she really said it or not, the famous designer Janelle, but she said you should take away an accessory or take away something to make an outfit complete. And so what Michelle does when she plans her day is she says, what can I take off of this list for today, and make the list lighter? And she also asks herself, where can I ask for help? So I love these strategies. I use them. I need to use them even more, but I think that is a really great thing to do. People are constantly overwhelmed and burnt out. And Michelle's a fellow spoonie. She lives with chronic illness just like I do. And a lot of us do. And I think it's very important for everyone, but especially those with chronic illnesses, to look at what can I take off of this list for today, and you'll be able to accomplish more and preserve your health and energy. And lesson number 3, I learned from Ashley. She was a freelance copywriter, and then she became an in-house copywriter, and then she does some freelance copy consulting on the side. And what I learned from her is sometimes the noise out there in the world, or the common advice, isn't always accurate. The common advice is you should quit your job and freelance if you want more money and more freedom. But Ashley actually made more money and worked less hours by quitting freelancing and going in-house for a traditional job. So sometimes the traditional job route can bring you more wealth and more freedom than freelancing, depending upon how you're wired and what the opportunity is and how your freelance business is going. And I never thought about that. But I also had a good experience. I worked in-house briefly, and it was an upgrade in certain ways. So the conventional wisdom is always the job is evil and freelancing is the only way. But sometimes, even if it's only temporarily, taking an in-house position could be the leg up you need. So that was a lesson I learned from Ashley, and I'm really grateful to her for it. So those are my 3 lessons I learned from my guests, and 3 lessons I learned from podcasting in general. It has been a whole year and it has been amazing. Oh, I want to throw in a bonus lesson. I learned to pace myself. Instead of trying to do a podcast every week, I just did a monthly podcast, and that helped me not burn out. And that's part of the reason I was able to make it a whole year, is because I just did a monthly podcast. So sometimes doing less is more. Doing less over a long period of time is more than coming out of the gate sprinting and burning out. With TikTok, I came out of the gate running. I was sprinting, and I quickly ran out of steam and burnt out because I was trying to do too many videos at once. But with Business Models for Creators, I just did 1 episode per month. And some of my episodes were so long, like I record for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So I was able to break them up into 2 episodes. So it was like one load of work, but then I was able to get more content from it. So that is probably one of my most important lessons I learned, that less is more. And if I do less, I can have more longevity. Instead of sprinting, go long distance and pace myself. So that is it. Thank you for listening. Thank you every time you tuned in. I'm so grateful for every listener. Thank you for every episode you've listened to or shared. I'm not sure what's to come for season 2. It's still in the works, but for the summer, I am going on season break and will replay some of my favorite episodes. So stay tuned for that. I appreciate you so much as a listener. I couldn't do this without you, and I am so grateful. And to all of my creators, keep creating.